Okay, welcome everyone to English 203, Reading and Writing about Literature 2. As promised, and as you can see here, today we're going to cover, excuse me, the various elements of poetry. There's around 40 of them. I think the lecture takes about 30 minutes. And I would simultaneously email you these. So look out for that Word document with all the elements of poetry listed that you can look at your leisure later on, if you need to access when you're writing your essays for this class. Also, we're supposed to cover, according to the course outline for January 7th, Elements Poetry Review, which we're getting here, the lecture. I'm going to send you the rubric, which will list what an A paper is, what a B paper is, what a C paper is, and it really elaborates all the way down to a failing paper, what they look like. So moving forward, you have that if you need to reference that, and it could justify your grade when need be. Okay, so there are many elements of poetry. I've collected 40 of them that I think are important, especially for this class, and especially as it pertains to uh, Charles Wright's Black Zodiac collection of poetry, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at them. And bear in mind too, I've used this lecture in a number of classes. So if I mention other books or other assignments or other due dates, please just disregard them and know this is for our 203 class. Okay, so let's move forward. Just a quick note on the last slide. If for whatever reason individuals can't get Black Aperture uh, by say Thursday of this week, let me know, or I got to figure something else out in order to make provisions for that. Okay, so elements of poetry. There's 40 of them that I've assembled. I think of the most important elements that a writer has to use, and a poet certainly uses within their writing, and a lot of it overlaps with other forms, other genres of writing, such as novel, creative nonfiction, memoir. So a lot of those things, the poetics of it overlap. So number one, imagery, the language building the image, one of the most important aspects that a poet can utilize and that we have to sort of parse from the poetry that we're reading is how they utilize image to infuse the poetry with meaning. We derive a lot from our world that we live in through image, right? We're completely image based in our society. Think about it, how motivated we are by the image. I like to use the example. Years ago, as many of you, it still exists, MTV, right? But where we have the image, the video, and the music superimposed over it, right? We had these two things married together in concert. We needed the image for whatever reason. We were fine for a long time with just radio, just music, right? But then it became very important to have the image. Of course, we get our music videos now probably from YouTube and other outlets. Simile. A lot of times the image is built, the imagery is built through metaphor and simile. So number two, simile. Comparing one thing to another thing that is different, employing like or as, right? Number three, metaphor. Similar to simile, comparing one thing to another thing that is different, you're employing the word is, so you're making a direct comparison with metaphor, whereas simile is making a weaker comparison, but still a comparison nonetheless. And I think the most important thing we should look for in the poetry when we're accessing metaphor and simile is how strong they are, how disparate the two things that are being compared are, because that's where we really start to see effective, evocative poetry is when we have metaphor and simile, and the two things being compared through metaphor and simile are distinguished and they're different, right? So, for example, if you were to say through a simile about a man, what he looked like, he was as skinny as a compass needle, right? They're very disparate things, the images, a man versus a compass needle. And the more disparate and different and opposite they are, the more intriguing the metaphor or simile is. Concrete. Number four is using language to impart some objective truth, usually by way of the image. So concrete is the opposite of number five, which is abstract. Concrete is the image. We can derive meaning always from the image. We all, in this classroom, I can give an image and we can all understand what it is and what it's attempting to impart. Most likely, there will be general consensus. There's an objective truth to it. But if I were to give words to describe maybe the image, it's less concrete, it's more abstract in the realm of abstraction. So number five, abstract. It's using language centered around emotion that has the ability to be subjective. Subjective meaning it's different to each and every one of us in the classroom, maybe. If I were to ask you, uh, what honor, courage, or commitment, or any type of emotion was, each person in the classroom might have a different interpretation. In the Marine Corps, I was in the Marine Corps in the United States for 10 years. And we would have to carry around a card in our breast pocket of our uniform, our camouflage uniform. And it was what we called our core values. And our core values were honor, courage, and commitment. I like to use this as an example because um, it's hard sort of to define what honor, courage, and commitment is. And so we would get challenged every so often. Hey, Marine or Devil Dog, they call us Devil Dogs, right? What does courage mean to you? And then you'd have to come up with some way of explaining what courage is because it's so abstract. What is honor, right? How do you explain that? You can explain it through the image, through using concrete images, which is built through metaphor and simile. So just bear that in mind as we're moving forward with these various texts that we're going to address, that abstract has to be balanced with some level of concrete, which is made available through the image. We can't have pure abstraction. And in the same way, we can't just have pure concrete. We can't just have images being thrown at us in the poetry. It has to be balanced with telling and showing. So showing would be concrete, the image. Abstraction would be telling. And we're going to address that later on in this lecture. Okay, so this slide is similar, some of the concepts on here, namely 6 and 7, to the last slide we looked at, and that's objective and subjective. So objective, number 6, imparts truth by way of the image, and therefore is concrete, as we all can agree on the image's meaning. Subjective, number 7, the language is abstract in nature, and therefore could be interpreted differently among each of us. In this way, we could see how closely related subjective is to abstract, and objective is to concrete. I wouldn't worry too much if you can't get your head wrapped around these two ideas yet, right? I think it's going to come to you. I'm going to hammer the idea home, the image being objective and therefore concrete, and abstractions being subjective. Number 8, symbolism. I think we're familiar with this. Something standing in for something else within the writing. And we're going to look for opportunities to pull that from the text. What is it symbolically attempting to convey to the reader? And that's typically by way of image as well. Number 9, theme. Some thread within the work that communicates an overarching message. Think about the main idea as being a relative of theme. Love is grand, war is hell, imparting some wisdom concerning the human condition. I think that's going to be an important part that we're going to write about within our short essays and in other types of discussions that we're going to have this semester, is what theme is the author of this poetry, the poet, attempting to infuse, either intentionally or unintentionally. There's some things that are going to materialize within the work that say, in Black Aperture, Matt Rasmussen, the poet, had no idea he was attempting to infuse in the writing, right? So that's okay. I want this classroom to be an open forum, open marketplace of ideas, where you can interpret something from the text that maybe the poet didn't intend. That's completely okay concept within this class. Number 10, story. We might not tend to think about poetry having a story. I would say certainly free verse, what we're looking at. Free verse poetry certainly has story in it. It lends itself to that because it's called narrative poetry, free verses. That's another word you can use in this class, part of your lexicon within this class of poetry is narrative poetry, which is synonymous with free verse, which is the same thing as prosaic. You can use all three of those terms because narrative poetry is prose-like or prosaic. So story, writing is attempting to infuse the work with a plot, which may contain a beginning, a middle, and an end. Don't worry about the poem having to be so tidy and encapsulated that it has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has, maybe it's just an instant in time. And sometimes that happens within poetry. So let's just look for opportunities where we can parse these various elements out of it. Some other important concepts with regard to elements of poetry, and we kind of touched on this, especially number 12 in the last slide. So number 11, hydraulics. A rarely used term within poetry, but it should be used more because it's completely related to how a poem is working or not working. How a poem moves and what actually moves it from the first line to its end. Is the author relying upon sound? Is the poet relying upon rhyme? What is the way that they're utilizing language in order to move the poem forward? And I'm going to parse out opportunities to demonstrate what hydraulics is as this class moves. This is a general term. You can use it in a general sort of way. I mean, I'll show you maybe today when we look at a poem by Robert Creeley, a famous poet, dead now, lived a full life, so you don't have to cry for him. But it's a really good poem, and we're going to look at how it moves itself. What are the hydraulics of it? Number 12, what we touched upon in the last slide: narrative poetry, uh, also known as prosaic poetry, also known as free verse. We can refer to the poetry we're going to look at this whole semester is any of these three things when we write about it. Okay, so what it means is it has sorry, it should be no, has no rhyme scheme. It is not metrical in any way, meaning it doesn't attempt to count or measure stressed or unstressed syllables, right? Uh, what does do that is number 13, meter or verse poetry. It utilizes the measured line to impart meaning to the reader. So it would use stressed and unstressed syllables in a marked pattern. Could be rhymed or unrhymed. 14, rhyme, just that. Words with similar sound effects are used sonically manipulate the language. Think about tempo being affected through rhyming words, especially speeding up. The poem we're going to look at today by Robert Creeley, he has a number of techniques he does to speed up and slow down um, his poems, his lines within the poetry. So it's not rhyme. Rhyme certainly does speed up the way we read poetry, but he uses white space and he uses sort of an economy of language, an economy of spelling, actually, to speed his poetry up, and he does it for a reason, and we'll touch on that in a moment. Number 15, narrator or speaker. Is the person talking a poem, not to be confused with the author. I think there's an important distinction between the two. So I might talk about, I will talk about today the Robert Creeley poem, I Know a Man. The title of it is I Know a Man. So I don't, when I read the poem and I hear the individual's voice on the paper sort of pop off of the paper, uh, I don't ever assume that the speaker is the author. It's kind of confusing, but just assume it's a narrator, really, right? Someone separate from the author. Yes, the author wrote it. Yes, the author is the person manipulating the language on the paper. Yes, the author is deciding and making decisions what to keep in, what to keep out. But it's the narrator is what we're going to speak about. And we'll look at examples in the future for that as well. Okay, here are some other important concepts with regard to elements of poetry. So stanza uh, is made up of lines of poetry. The stanza is like the container that is a paragraph. I would say they're closely related to the stanza, right? It's a nice, tidy sort of paragraph, highly compressed paragraph. Um, and then we have line breaks. Number 17, lines of poetry intentionally interrupted by punctuation or white space on the page. And then we have 18, punctuation, utilized in order to affect pacing, tempo, meaning, and to emphasize parts of the poem. Number 19, white space, empty space on the page in order to create an effect. The effect can be manifold. It could be like we're looking at this slide now. You see the white space between 16 and 17, between 17 and 18. Is it double spaced? Is it single spaced? What are they doing? Are they tabbing over some lines, some words? Right? We're creating white space to ultimately to control pacing. Either you speed up or you slow down. Structure, number 20, how the poem is built. Spaced, double spaced, just lines versus lines broken off into stanzas, which we just sort of touched upon. So what I would ask, I think these are important elements. 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. Stanza, line breaks, punctuation, white space, structure. They're all closely related. It's how a poem is built, how it looks on the page, how it sits there. What's it attempting to communicate or do? How is it attempting to manipulate the language or the sound? All I ask moving forward with regard to these is to respect everything that's on the page. So as you're reading something, we're about to look at an example with Robert Creeley, I Know a Man, is you have to respect the line breaks and the punctuation and what the author was attempting to do. All right, and I think that really helps with having great fidelity to what the author intended it to sound like, right? And has an effect of some sort. All right, so here we go. Poem example, white space and punctuation. Everything we just spoke about in the last slide. And how I want you to attempt to read the poem with and have great respect or pay close attention, think about it that way, to the punctuation and the white space. Um, I, so I Know a Man, Robert Creeley. I'll read it aloud, and then we'll sort of inspect how it's respecting white space and punctuation, and what effect it's attempting to imbue to the reader. I know a man. As I said to my friend, because I am always talking, John, I said, which was not his name, the darkness sure rounds us. What can we do against it, or else shall we, and why not buy a goddamn big car? Drive it, he said. For Christ's sake, look out where you're going. All right, so I think there's a lot going on here. I think we could see uh, he's compressing some of the language, as you see in the first line, right? Uh, as I said to my, right? So he's saying Sid instead of said, compressing the language for effect. Is it because he's attempting to copy sort of a different dialect to how someone speaks? Maybe. That would be my guess. Is it because he's attempting to speed the poem up? I would say yes. That would be my guess as well. And then you would have to pose the question as to why. Why is Robert Creeley in this poem attempting to speed the lines up by way of compressing the language, by leaving vowels out of certain words? And he's doing it. Maybe, and we all have interpretations, but my interpretation with working with Creeley, with working with his poetry over the years, is that he's attempting to imbue some anxiety, level of anxiety, right? Hesitance, with regard to the narrator, the person in the poem who's speaking, all right, the speaker or the narrator. And I think it's effective in doing so. He has short, choppy lines. Look how short the lines are. We're going to look at poems that are much longer in line length. I think Matt Rasmussen writes in this sort of way. And perhaps he's attempting to imbue the poem with the feeling and emotion of anxiety as well. So let's look at, as I said to my, it's not a full sentence, right? It's a short line that gets sort of truncated. We don't know what it's attempting to say until we read the whole stanza. And even then, I think holistically, we have to look at the entire poem to understand the meaning of it. Other things he's doing within the poem, in line, let's see, the second stanza, the second line, he hyphenates surrounds us, right? So it's sort of truncated as well. So let's look at he's using 3 lines per stanza. And then he has 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas, right? He could have mashed this all into one stanza. Maybe it would have moved too quickly. He's wanting to use that white space, if you look at in between each stanza, in order to maybe speed us up and then slow us down. We're being sped up with the compression of the language, and we're being slowed down with the white space between the stanzas. That's like almost like a push-pull effect. And he could be doing this for a number of reasons, to create tension, conflict between the two things, the push versus the pull. Yeah, and if you look at the very last line of the poem, he collapses the word year by taking the E and A out, the vowels, into a very short, truncated year. Out where you're going. Look out where you're going. Other meanings could be derived from this. Did they ever get a car? Or was they just sort of, was it all supposition? What they were going to go do this one thing, and why? Many questions about this poem. Some will be answered, some will be questions for the philosophers. All right, some other concepts that we were going to touch upon. We touched upon in the last slide. We didn't give them names yet. We were just talking about respecting punctuation and white space, and stanza breaks, right? Which is the white space. But other tools and elements that the poet will utilize that we have to look out for and parse from the material, from the texts this semester, is enjambment, end stopped, caesura, mimetic, and content. So enjambment, incomplete thought or language at the end of a line that allows the poetic line to bleed over to the next line. We saw that within Robert Creeley's poem. The next slide is going to show, we're going to look at the same poem, and I'm going to point out where it's being enjammed, lines are being enjammed. 22, end stopped. It's just what it sort of sounds like, is the poem ends with punctuation, or sorry, the line ends with punctuation. So we're going to look out for opportunities to sort of view that within the poem. And he doesn't do it much, and I Know a Man. Creeley doesn't until he gets to the very end. And the hard stop is typically a period. 23, caesura. A break in a stanza where meaning within a line bleeds over from one stanza to the next. So enjambment bleeds over from one line to the next. Caesura bleeds over from one stanza to the next. And Robert Creeley does that, and we're going to point that out in the next slide. Mimetic. Think about how the structure of the poem attempts to imitate the content of the poem. I like to point out Billy Collins. He's a very famous poet, based in New York. He's a professor of English and older guy, but he's probably one of the most read poets in America in Western society. For a number of reasons. People say he's highly accessible, meaning they don't have to have a poetry background, a degree in poetry like I do, in order to sort of understand what he's saying. So anybody could pick up a Billy Collins poem and understand what he's saying, derive meaning from it. What is he attempting to convey is on the surface. You don't have to dig too far. I remember hearing that years ago, and then some of the poems that I introduce in other classes, namely English 203, that we look at from Billy Collins, I tend to disagree nowadays. I think it's on some level he's become either more sophisticated in the way he's writing, or maybe the rumors of him being highly accessible were erroneous. At any rate, he has a poem called Waterfall, and the poem unfolds on the page uh, with the lines are all the same length, and there are no stanza breaks, and it pours down the page like it's a waterfall. In that way, it's mimetic. It's mimesis. It's attempting to imitate the words on the page are attempting to imitate a waterfall itself. All right, 25 content. And by the way, mimetic. It's just a word you need to keep in your poetic pockets. I don't think we're going to look at any. We might look at an example intentionally, but I don't think any of the texts that are required reading for this class will have necessarily anything that's mimetic in it. But just know that word exists. 25 content. What the poem is attempting to impart. The words on the page. It's content. Okay, let's look at opportunities here where Robert Creeley is intentionally incorporating enjambment, end stopped, and caesura within his content, which is the poem itself, right? So we can see it right away in stanza 1. We see enjambment at the end of the first line. As I said to my, so it's an incomplete sentence. It's an incomplete thought. He's enjamming my. Uh, and then we get friend because I am, and another enjambment with I am incomplete. Always talking, John I. Now we get the caesura, right? The break, the bleeding over of John I to the second stanza said. So this whole poem is enjambed and caesuraed. Caesured between sentences or between stanzas and jammed between lines. And then we sort of get the end stop at the very end of the poem, right? Not all poetry, you're going to see this semester, not all poetry ends with an end stop. Not all poetry has a period at the very end. And it has to do with what we're going to look at later in this lecture, a couple slides from now, is called aesthetics. What does a poet tend to write like? Does it tend to use the structuring element of an end stop to period at the end of the poetry, at the end of lines? In this case, his personal aesthetic is to not use the end stop until he gets to the very end. Right? You don't see end stop anywhere within the poem. All we get is commas, maybe an em dash before John, but never sort of the hard period at the end of each line. Okay, so and interesting, I just caught this. If you look at the third stanza, in the second line of the third stanza, he uses an ampersand instead of spelling out and. He uses the symbol, the ampersand. It or else shall we and why not buy a goddamn big car. So it's interesting that he would use a symbol for the word instead of using the word. And we would ask ourselves why. Why is he doing that? Are there other symbolic things? Is that what he's gesturing towards? We don't know necessarily. So at the very end, the last line of the very last fourth stanza, out there, out where you're going, right? Period. End stopped. Okay, so we have about 15 more elements to go. Let's see. 26. Didacticism. So being didactic, or preachy, or professorial in tone. So it's a poem that's attempting to sort of teach the reader something, right? So we look out for that. It's to be avoided, typically. You don't want typically a poem to be didactic. Or attempting to persuade you, right? It wants to stand for something, sure. It wants to impart something, convey something to the reader, of course. But it never wants to hit them over the head with the concept, which would be dipping its toe into the waters of didacticism. So it's to be avoided, and we could look for it, see if we can find it. I've read poems that you could sort of derive meaning, but also other poems where they are attempting to change your state of mind with available through the poetics, because poetics is persuasive in nature. 27, compression. We mentioned this before. Saying the most in a concise space. The best poets, the best poems are able to incorporate some heightened level of compression. Uh, the littlest amount of language imparting the most amount of meaning. And we're going to look out for poets that are very good at compression, right? Imparting the most amount of meaning in the smallest amount of space, and poets that are not so good. 28, setting, just like in a novel or a short story or creative nonfiction. Poetry also has a place in time and a place itself. Where is it and when is it? Where does it take place? When does it take place? What era? Is it within our own? Can we relate to it because it's in our own era? Or is it 300 years ago and it's distant to us? Or even, we're not going to look at 300-year-old poetry, but even some of the poetry I've taught in other classes, and we're going to look at it in this class too, it's removed from time, maybe by 30 years, and sometimes it's hard to relate to the setting. Is that a barrier to understanding, to deriving meaning because the setting is 30 years ago? The question could be raised. 29, objective correlative. So think of correlative as it's correlating one thing to another. It's kind of like symbolism, an extended symbolism. If you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm not sure if that's part of the Canadian canon in high school, but it certainly is in America. It's required reading, what's called the canon. Yeah, and so in reading To Kill a Mockingbird, you have a sort of a mysterious character that everybody in the neighborhood is afraid of. They have anxiety towards and fear even. And his name is Boo Radley. And he's an objective correlative. He stands in for a greater meaning, which is fear and anxiety, right? So the author would have used Boo Radley as a vehicle to deliver that sort of symbolism, that he's symbolic of this emotion of anxiety, or he's an objective correlative. Number 30, show versus tell. We touched on this before, and that has to do with concrete versus abstract. Just as a reminder, concrete is the image, usually built through metaphor and simile to create imagery, versus abstract, which is telling, right? Concrete would be showing, abstract and abstraction would be telling. The image versus the absence of an image. Okay, moving right along. Number 31, repetition. Within a poem, we saw the repetition of I within Robert Creeley's poem, and in the next slide, we'll look at the repetition, the pacing, and the tempo, and even the diction, number 33, and register and dialect. So number 31, repetition, is repeating a word anytime throughout the poem and throughout the lines. And anaphora is repetition at the beginning of a passage. So to sort of understand the difference, anaphora is the beginning of a line or a stanza, a repetition at the beginning, and repetition itself is just anywhere in the poem. It can exist anywhere in the poem. 32, sonic engagement, the sound of the language and music of the line, right? So one could compare music to poetry, right? So if we look at, say, a hip hop song, they have a lot of the same overlap. You could take a poem and create a hip hop song out of it, right? But it lacks the music. The poem does. It doesn't have the string, the guitars, the drums, the beat. It has to manufacture or synthesize that beat itself, right? Using punctuation and white space and using sound of the language. So think about the music of the line, how it sonically engages the reader, how it hits your ear. So we can do this in a number of ways. You can do it by focusing on assonance, which is the vowels, and consonants, the repetition of consonants, right? Number 33 is, we're going to see this within Robert Creeley's poem, I Know a Man. Register, or diction, or dialect. High versus low register. Conversational versus academic. So if you think about register, if you read something, you can say, wow, it was like just having a conversation with my friend. It was conversational. It wasn't academic at all. It's a lower register, all right, or a middle register, if not lower. And then a high register would be if it is academic. And you could change the register in a number of ways. One could be the diction or the dialect. Is the individual, do they sound like they have a dialect or diction, the words they use, diction, dialect, the way they say those words, from another area of the say in Canada? They sound like they're from backwaters or from a different region, right? That would be the dialect. And I think Robert Creeley is attempting to infuse the poem with dialect, especially with leaving those vowels out of some of those words. Number 34, torqued language, especially verbs. So think about within the language itself, the writer's utilizing. Are they using really strong action verbs, right? Are they torquing them? So the example I like to use is you could use run, great. We could look for individuals that are using verbs like run, sort of pedestrian, run-of-the-mill sort of words, right? They're not torqued. Versus dash, that's better. Dash is much better than run. And then versus dart. Dart would probably be the best, maybe, depending on the application. So we're sitting here and we're torquing the language, twisting it until we get the right verb, right, for the right situation. And we're going to look for opportunities where the author is doing that. 35. We spoke about this before, and this has a lot to do with what Robert Creeley is doing within his poem through white space and punctuation and cutting down on the language, compressing it, and compression itself, pacing and tempo. Mean the same thing. Speed in which the poem moves. Is it fast? Is it slow? Is it hastened? Is it methodical? Is it rushed? Etc. Okay, so for example, if we're going to look at Robert Creeley's poem, I Know a Man, with regard to pacing, diction, compression, and repetition, we can see the pacing. He's speeding the poem up and slowing it down. We call it the push-pull effect. And we believe he's doing that to create some sort of tension or conflict. The push versus the pull, a tug of war in a way. A person who's taking stock and having anxiety in and of within themselves, right? Yet he's trying to create that sort of emotion on the page. And he's doing so, made it available through enjambment at the end of each line, and then the caesura between each stanza, cutting it off to where there's not full meaning. There's not a full sentence. We can't derive full meaning out of the line until it bleeds over to the next line, and then the next line, into the next stanza, to the next stanza. Then maybe at the end we can have sort of a holistic understanding of what he's attempting to say, what both the narrator is attempting to say, but also Robert Creeley as the poet. So diction. Is he using diction here? I think he is. If we look at the first line, he's leaving out the A of the AI out of as I said to my friend, right? Which shortens it, it compresses it, but also maybe he's attempting to imitate some different dialect or diction of someone else, of some region, someone who's from a different region. Compression. There's compression throughout here, the whole poem. We know that. We could see that within how short the lines are, how choppy they are, deriving the most amount of meaning in the smallest amount of space. I think he's allowing us to do that. He's giving us just enough meaning for us to get to the poem. And then we have to sit back and sort of understand and comprehend and dissect what it actually is he's attempting to say, if anything. Then he's able to use repetition with the eyes. Look at the three eyes within the first stanza. That sort of creates some pacing when you have the repetition of something that allows the poem to speed up. Okay, here we go. The final page and slide for elements of poetry. 36, conflict slash tension. They both mean the same thing. Those terms, conflict and tension, are interchangeable. And in any type of writing, there's always going to be conflict. There's always going to be tension. And the best type of writing has the most unique sort of conflict and tension. So it's conflict and tension is especially available to the reader through mixed images. We see this with similes, we see this with metaphors, mixing the images up. So here we get the simile of thin as a compass needle, right? So a man maybe is as thin as a compass needle. We can easily see a man, right? That's a universal sort of symbol to us that we know we can sort of picture in our head. But then we get the little bit the comparison through like or as to a compass needle, which makes there's a great amount of conflict and tension that exists between the two in order to extract an actual image in our head of a man being as thin as a compass needle. Okay, so let's look for opportunities of that within the poetry that we read this semester. What conflict, what tension it contains. Surely they do. 37, unpack meaning from the abstractions. So we always want to take abstractions, those big term words that really express emotion a lot of times that mean nothing unless we surround it with more concrete language. So abstractions like love and honor and courage and commitment and all those things, right? So we have to unpack those. We have to elaborate past simply telling by utilizing the image. The image, as I said before, it stands in as something universal. It's highly objective. We could all interpret an image almost nearly the same. If I offered you an image of something, we would almost nearly interpret it the same. So therefore, we'd like to take abstractions and cast them to the world of concrete. That's usually available through the image. So we'll look for opportunities where poets are doing that this semester. Let's see, 38. Extracting meaning through a poem's title. The title of any poem is highly intentional, highly methodical on the poet's part, on the author's part. He or she would have sat down and contemplated for a long time what they would make the title, or they would have started with the title and then created the poem from there. It would have sprung and materialized from that title. I think the other way is more common. I know myself as a poet, I start with
an idea that I want to write about, and then maybe at the end I write the title and it has to reflect something within the poem, I think. So in the case of I Know a Man, the poem we've been grappling with this entire lecture is what service, the question becomes, is this title providing for the actual content of the poem, if any? It should be something, right? So we have to ask ourselves as we proceed through the semester, as we look at really evocative poetry, we have to ask ourselves, what is the title? What service is it providing for that poem? These are all subject matters for essays we can write this semester as we travel through the landscape of these collections of poetry. We should look for opportunities, such as in 39, where the author is maybe placating, or we know that they were able to avoid being cliche or trite. Trite just means old, or hackneyed. Those are all interchangeable. Uh, so trite or hackneyed or old or cliche images and cliche language. Uh, some of this poetry is not, it's contemporary poetry, but it's maybe removed from a few decades from uh, being freshly published. So we might ask ourselves, do these images hold up? Does this language hold up? Is it antiquated in some way, in some form? And if it is, if the answer is yes, then we say to ourselves that we might be able to use this language within an essay. It seems as if here Robert Creeley needed to sort of melt down and recast that image or make the language fresh again because it was trite, cliche, hackneyed, etc. 40, aesthetics or style. So the personal style the poet typically uses within their work would be their personal aesthetic or their personal style. I think aesthetics is a better word. But so if you think about Creeley, we know Creeley likes to use economy of vowels, economy of language even. So that he leaves language out. He leaves letters out, vowels typically, to speed up the pacing. That's his personal aesthetics. He wants to create a mood or a tone that is slow, that is quick, that is anxious in tone. And that is great segue into 41, tone. Often described as a mood that pervades the experience of reading the poem. When reading a poem, we can ask ourselves, is the tone loud, arrogant, dark, soft, tempered, resolute, etc.? I Know a Man, Robert Creeley's poem, would have an anxious or nervous tone that he is very cognizant of. He creates that anxious and nervous tone by taking out vowels so he could speed the pacing up. So see how all these things are connected so he can speed the pacing up. And that push-pull of the pacing, speeding up, slowing down, uh, can also be interpreted as how he's building conflict and tension within his poetry. So all these things start to really intertwine of all these elements of poetry, poetic terms. Finally, 42, locus of concern. What is the actual poem about? Its locus of concern. What is the poem concentrating on? Uh, it may be referred to as the poem's conceit. In I Know a Man, our universal example here, we say that the locus of concern, or its conceit, is probing the depth of the human condition in order to demonstrate how we are all fighting against unseen elements. In the case of the poem, he mentions the darkness, right? And how they want to escape that, right? By buying a goddamn big vehicle or car and escaping it. Okay, we covered a lot with regard to all the elements of poetry, at least the ones that I feel they're important that I was able to collect and enumerate for you within this lecture. Um, so you might have some questions, and that's fine. So please email me, as you can see here, if you have any questions, concerns, and anything we've covered thus far. And also I would have simultaneously emailed you the list of the elements of poetry that you could reference at your leisure. Um, okay, yeah, next week, new lecture, moving forward. Uh, if you don't have any questions, I'll just send you the link then, and we'll move forward in the class. Thanks, guys. Bye.